Hi, this is Augustin, and this is another episode of Ask Augustin, presented by Tonebase. And today I'm going to talk about when it's okay to not do what the composer writes. I'm always trying to figure out what did the composer want and then make that come to life. And of course, following the instructions very carefully is kind of the first step. Well, actually, maybe the first step is to get a good edition that actually accurately reflects what the composer wrote in the first place, because a lot of older editions add a lot of stuff and change things. But then the second step is you're figuring out, reading that very, very carefully and doing what the composer says. But there are some circumstances in which, to get even closer to what the composer wanted, you can actually change some things for different reasons. One example might be when a composer is writing dynamics the way they want to hear them in the hall when they're sitting in the hall. But practically, when you play a concerto with orchestra, you might have to play much, much louder than what's printed. And you might have to, as a result, use more bow, maybe separate some bows, even though they're slurred, so that in practice, what the audience hears will be more like the dynamics that are printed in the score. So one example of that is in the Dvorak Violin Concerto, which has famously kind of thick orchestration. There are often a lot of wind players playing with the violin, and the violin line is often not at the top, but actually in the middle or at the bottom of this kind of chorale that it forms with the winds. And Dvorak, however, writes a lot of dynamics that are more the way maybe he wants to hear the piece, not what you want to play. So if a horn is playing and the violin is playing, and you write forte for the horn and forte for the violin, a forte on the violin is a different volume than a forte on the horn. It's just much, much louder. So for those two to match, you might have to write piano for the horn, forte for the violin, and then they might be more similar in volume. But some composers don't do that. They write more like how they hear it. So here's an example in the second movement of the Dvorak Concerto, where after... Dvorak writes pianissimo, but if I played this way with a whole orchestra, you probably would actually not hear it anymore when I get softer. So instead, I find a way to keep quite a soft character to the sound, but I raise the volume not by pressing more, but by using a lot of bow speed, and so I manage to make a sound that still sounds somewhat light, even though I made it much louder. So the difference will be... and now the pianissimo effect. So by changing the color, I can still make a difference. But if I play much softer than that, it would be difficult to hear. Now, of course, this all depends on the situation on stage. How loud is the orchestra actually playing, and what's the other acoustics of the hall? In some situations, I might be able to actually go much softer and still be okay. And in some places, I really need to really push, kind of normalize the dynamics. Not normalize. I need to kind of compress the dynamics, make the pianissimo sound quite a lot louder than what a pianissimo would be for me, in order for it to still sound like it matches the winds in that place. There might be times when just playing louder doesn't cut it. You might need additional bow. And sometimes there are moments when I actually prepare several bowings, depending on what the acoustics are going to be, or like how loud the orchestra is playing, then I have the option to use more bow. For example, in Sibelius Concerto, on that long note, which has a big crescendo on it. Um, Ideally, I want to play like this on one bow. However, sometimes um, orchestras can be they get kind of carried away. The strings come in and it's very rich sound and it's beautiful, but as a result, you're not going to hear most of that note actually until the very end, and I think that's too bad. So sometimes what I do is to have additional bow, I actually go up, down, not all the way at the frog, but it gives me an additional bit of bow. And so that, and I prepare this bowing just in case, so that if I need it, I know how to do it in a situation when the balance is a bit tougher and I feel like I need a bit more sound. There are some other places in the Sibelius concerto where I also prepare several options of bowings. So, for example, at the high point of the second movement, which is very, 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 very loud, sometimes that's not enough sound once the orchestra really does the crescendo. So I also prepare the bowing of basically using as much bow as possible. And it sounds a bit ridiculous if you play that way, with piano or in a smaller room. But in a big hall, that's actually not a ridiculous amount of sound at all, because you hear the volume relative to what the orchestra is producing, and it's producing this intense, majestic sound in this place. And actually, this is you're just only keeping up with them. And so I learned to just prepare this bowing. So the key is to figure out what did the composer really want with the markings they wrote. And sometimes there is a way to get to the same place, even if you do it slightly differently. In the case of slurs and breaking up slurs, changing slurs, it's usually key to keep the articulation the same. So if you are putting more on the same bow, if the composer wrote, but you want to play, then you would have to still articulate the same way so that it basically sounds to the ear like the way the composer wrote. In the case of breaking up a slur, you want to make the bow change smooth enough that it still sounds like it's connected. Some composers give very sparse instructions. One of the things I love about Brahms is he writes very, very little in the music, but everything he writes is extremely significant. I think he actually probably deleted anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. So everything you see, every crescendo he writes, or if he writes an accent, or if he writes dolce or espressivo, or both, these are really, really, there's a lot of significance, and you can think a long time about what that means. And it often reflects something that happens underneath harmonically, or there's something structural in the piece. So it's very deep. Other composers are much more liberal in how they use these and what they write into the music. And some composers actually write, I think, too much. Especially some in the contemporary era, there are many pieces where every note has some kind of instructions on it. Where at some point I feel like, it's the composer is really like micromanaging everything I'm doing. In general, the further you go back in time, the less is written in the music, the more freedom you have yourself, and the closer you get to our time, the more composers write in. Eugène Ysaÿe is a very special example, because of course he was a violinist himself, a great violinist, and he wrote his 6 violin sonatas, which are extremely difficult, and he marked his parts very heavily, which is enormously helpful. Basically, I think the learning curve to learn an Ysaÿe sonata is so much shorter because he gave us all these wonderful fingerings and basically an interpretation that's written in a very, very detailed way. And overall, I think his markings are fantastic. But I asked the question, did he really intend for every violinist to play it the same way? I don't think that was really the intention. he wrote at the start of the first edition that these markings are basically to help you get started with the piece. It's not that it must be played this way in every case. And there are actually many places in Ysaÿe sonatas where I find the fingerings in particular reflect his particular technique and what was comfortable for his hand. But every hand is different, and there are fingerings that, for me, just sound so much better than what he wrote. And I think there are times when it is okay to not write what he, you try what he writes, but then if you find a better fingering that sounds better and maybe comes even closer to what the musical intention of the passage is, then I think it's totally okay to change it, to go your own way, because his markings are there to basically to help you get started. Now, there might be some fingerings that he writes that have a very specific musical significance, that he wants you to play on a specific string because he wants that color. And so I think those I'm very reluctant to change. But when something is just about getting from place A to place B, then sometimes there might be a better one. There's a passage in the third sonata by Eugène Ysaÿe, the ballade, where he writes this fingering. And which I find very uncomfortable because of this big shift and then the strain on the third and fourth finger here, and these shifts, where if you're not careful, it sounds very slidey and slurpy. And I found this other fingering for me, which is where I start down here and then shift here and then gradually inch my way up. In some cases, I also turn the bowing around. This passage in the second violin sonata. I found that if I turn the entire bowing around of the whole thing, for some reason, I get more the shapes that are in the music, and it is significantly easier to play cleanly. So the goal of this fingering and bowing change is basically to help me get it a bit cleaner. But the moments where I change from up bow to down bow are moments when it's actually helpful to be able to lift the bow very, very slightly. I also change some of the fingerings to involve less kind of noodly setting of the fingers. By taking a sixth with 2/4, for example, I, for a moment, reduce the tension. If I went, I would have to move the third finger up there, and also it would be a more tense situation. So these are very kind of personal solutions as I practice this and struggle with it and try to get it better, that I found, this works a little easier, this works a little easier. And for each person's hand, there might be slightly personalized fingerings that might be possible to find. And I make sure that the shape of the phrase and the dynamics that he writes, that I still make them even though I turn the bowing around. I think what ultimately matters is how it sounds. So if musically it sounds the same way, I don't think Ysaÿe would have minded. It is a bit different for each composer, because some composers write a lot into the music. Some composers write less than we might want. Some composers know the violin extremely, extremely well. And so Ysaÿe, of course, is an example. And so then they write a lot in. Sibelius also writes quite a lot into the part, and he knew the violin, the instrument, very, very well. Some composers don't know the violin very well, like Brahms or Beethoven. They have it slightly more limited, or Schumann maybe is a better example, where they're thinking as pianists primarily. And sometimes some of the markings are actually, you have to understand, this is a pianist talking, not a violinist. So that changes what some markings might mean, like dashes under a slur or dots under a slur means something else to a pianist than to a violinist, perhaps. And so each composer has a different. Then, yeah, it's very frustratingly, Paganini wrote basically nothing into the music, even though he probably had some really interesting fingerings, I'm sure, but he didn't reveal any of them, so that's, I think, a great loss for all of us. So it's a bit different in each situation, but the first step is always get a good edition and do everything the composer says. The second step is try to figure out what is the reason behind all these markings. You know, do they all mean the same thing? When a composer writes crescendo, how much crescendo? Why is the crescendo there? What's the cause of these markings? Because it's probably not just a random marking. It has some significance. And then maybe you can do some things differently in terms of the slurs or even the fingerings. Sometimes even dynamics based on the circumstances of the balance and the place you're playing in order to actually get even closer to what the composer might have wanted, in your opinion. So this is kind of the process I follow. I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you next time.